AWS step functions. Now, they're going to appear on the exam probably in the context of Lambda, but it's important for you to know what they are and a little bit about their use cases in compared to some of the other AWS services. So that's what we're going to cover here. AWS Step Functions is really just a managed workflow and orchestration platform. And as you might expect, it's scalable and highly available. And you can define something called a state machine. And we'll talk about this in the next slide. But for now, just know that there's different things that you can do inside that state machine. You can create tasks, steps, parallel steps or sequential steps, decision points like a branching path, or maybe even a timer. And how you do this is using the Amazon state language, which is a declarative JSON language that allows you to configure and document the steps of your step functions. Now, applications can interact and update via the step function API, or there is some direct integration with Lambda and some of the other AWS services. But what's really neat is there's a visual interface that helps describe the flow, and you can also drill into that and find out the real-time status of certain activities. And as you might guess, there's detailed logs captured for all the steps. Now, here's an example of something called a finite state machine. Now, it's more of a computer science concept, but Amazon has used the state machine concept in trying to describe what step functions do. And really, it's just a fancy name for a relatively simple system design. It just means that an object can assume different states or statuses through a process. And in this example, we use an order and what an order processing flow might look like. And the order can take different states as it travels through its life cycle. So it comes in as a new order, then we do a credit check, and that order can assume a canceled state or a verified state. And then once it gets shipped to the warehouse, it has a different state. And then ultimately it gets delivered. Then maybe after a period of time, maybe after our return period elapses, we move it into an archived state, or it could potentially be returned, and then we would do some other stuff to that order. So it's still the same object at the same order, but it's just assumed different states throughout its life cycle. Now, this is an exceedingly simple example of a step function. And this is one of the examples that Amazon provides. And it's simply waiting for a certain timestamp or waiting for a time, and then it's going to send an SNS message. So on the left here, you can see the Amazon state language rendition of this. And then on the right, this is the graphical visual representation that shows up in the console. So we would write the JSON on the left, and the console would interpret that and then render a picture for us. As much as we like to say that event-driven real-time applications are always preferred, there's still the need for good old batch processing. And so Amazon has created AWS Batch to help us with that. And AWS Batch is really just a tool to help us manage batch workloads on EC2 instances. And you can choose for Batch to either manage those compute instances dynamically by scaling out based on load, or you can control those yourself. And the steps are pretty easy. First, you have to define a compute environment, and you're given a choice. Either you can choose managed or unmanaged. And then you can also choose whether you want to use spot instances or on-demand instances. And then you can also specify how many virtual CPUs you need. And then once we've created a compute environment, we can create a job queue, and we can assign a priority to that job queue, and then also assign that job queue to our compute environment. Then finally, we create a job definition, and this can be a script, or you can use JSON. It can include environment variables, mount points, container images, IAM roles, all those things that would need to be there for your batch job to run. And then really all that's left is just scheduling that job. and we go ahead and schedule it, and AWS Batch takes care of running that at the prescribed time. And if we choose managed compute environment, it's going to scale out the needed infrastructure and then scale it back once the job is done. Now let's look at some comparisons, because for the CSA Pro exam, just like with Lambda, you're not going to have to know how to specifically write step functions, but rather you should know when they should be used in relation to other services and certain use cases. So step functions should be used when we just need an out-of-the-box coordination of AWS components. And an example would be that order processing flow that I showed earlier. Now, you might also recall simple workflow service. Now, AWS is recommending that any net new applications take a look at step functions over simple workflow services, because simple workflow services is kind of an aging service. Step functions is the new service, so they're trying to steer people towards that. But they're very similar still, and they could probably be used to meet the same exact use cases and same needs. But in the context of the exam, typically you're going to see simple workflow service more aligned around manual steps, or when there's manual intervention required. So when we would use it is if we need to support some sort of external processes, or maybe some ultra specialized logic that's not neatly contained within the AWS landscape. An example of this may be a loan application process where we have certain manual review steps, and maybe those steps take maybe 2 weeks to accommodate. Not saying they can't be done with step functions, but just generally speaking, Amazon tries to steer people towards simple workflow service when there's manual intervention required, or some sort of external processes that maybe are beyond the scope of AWS. Now, you'll recall that simple queue service is a messaging queue, and it's best suited for store and forward patterns. We would use SQS if we had kind of an inbound workflow and we needed to dole that workflow out to worker processes, like maybe in an image resizing process. That's a good use of SQS, and we probably wouldn't use step functions for that. Now, AWS Batch comes into play if we need to have reoccurring tasks that really don't require heavy decision-making logic inside of them. So if it's something like, rotating logs daily on a firewall appliance, that's something that AWS Batch is well suited for, and we probably wouldn't use step functions or SQS or SWF. So again, on the exam, you're not going to have to know how to build each one of these things specifically, but you should know what use case they fulfill and when you would use one versus the other.